Mr. Clark. Old Mr. Clark could hear a loud, mechanical whine coming from Mr. Harrison's apartment, a few doors down the hall from where he stood. It sounded to Mr. Clark as if a big, electric saw were working through a large piece of warped timber. He complained aloud to no one about the noisy racket it produced. What would possess Mr. Harrison to keep heavy shop equipment in an 8th-floor apartment, he asked. And why haven't I ever noticed him using it before? As he fumbled with his keys in the hall, the noise whined and pitched wildly as if very knotted wood were being fed into the blade, causing it to catch and snag dangerously as it cut. Mr. Clark made a mental note to listen carefully for the next hour, and to call Mr. Harrison a little later to ensure that he had finished his work without incident. Mr. Clark knew it was dangerous to woodwork alone when electrically powered machinery was involved. Mr. Clark put his afternoon tea on the stove, and walked into his den. The drop cloths and painter's tape were still all in place from this morning. Reopening a can of paint with a nearby screwdriver, he found a fresh brush and set about covering the final, unfinished wall with pigment. The old, drab ochre was nearly all gone. Now, the room would be a pleasant apricot. 10 minutes later, Mr. Clark poured his tea and turned off the burner. His back ached from reaching towards the ceiling with the brush, and so he took a break to enjoy his drink. Mrs. Tillman, his next-door neighbor, must have fallen asleep in front of the TV again. The shrieking, crying, and breaking glass sound effects which emanated from her apartment were too dramatic and bizarre to be anything besides action movie nonsense. By the time Mr. Clark had finished his tea, he noticed that the sky outside had taken on a hazy, ethereal pattern, shifting aggressively between black and smoky red as the clouds moved about. He frowned deeply, seeking an explanation which did not frighten him. To distract his mind, Mr. Clark worked meticulously on the walls of his den. When the finishing touches were done, he moved to the hall bathroom and began to wash his brushes. There, Mr. Clark detected strange sounds emanating from outside his front door. There was a din of frenetic noise outside, muffled only barely by his thick, faux oak door. Mr. Clark could hear the skittering and thumping and dragging of more than a dozen unholy things, which all seemed to be moving listlessly in the hallway. The peephole flickered between light and dark whenever one of the things moved past. Mr. Clark insisted to himself that his senses must all be mistaken. "I've become senile, or insane," he muttered insistently to himself. "Maybe I'm hallucinating from a stroke, or some kind of aneurysm. Maybe I fell while painting, and now I'm unconscious and dreaming on the floor." He wanted desperately to be part of any reality besides his own. Still, he felt far too coherent to be anything besides awake and lucid. Mr. Clark tried to peer out through the peephole, but the things outside frightened him away, rattling and slamming on his door as if excited to have found him. The pitchy, electric whine was closer now. The action movie sound effects of screaming voices and smashing glass were close enough now to surround Mr. Clark on all sides. In the den, he found his empty teacup smashed to bits on the floor by the ever-growing ruckus which was now shaking the walls. The temperature was steadily rising as well. Mr. Clark watched the nearby thermostat climb upwards with malevolent haste. As the room began to cook, tiny bubbles began to form in the still wet paint, marring the previously even surface. Mr. Clark wept. His favorite teacup was shattered, his den was ruined, and now he was sure, the satanic debt he swore 45 years ago was about to be collected.